Welcome, Hotshots, to Flashlight by Firepower X. Here you can find the industrial strength tools you need to dominate your personal and professional wellness as a firefighter. My name is Jess. I'm the creator of Firepower X and your host for today's webinar. And it's my pleasure to introduce our special guest today, Mr. James Rychard. He's a 23-year firefighter instructor in the City of Burlington, Ontario, Canada, our great neighbor to the north, an accomplished writer for both Firefighting in Canada and Canadian Firefighter magazines, and an award-winning advocate for both organizational and personal wellness in the fire service. And in his spare time, James enjoys actively engaging in nature and spending time away from the job, hiking, cycling, and training his greater Swiss mountain dog, Luna. Welcome, James. It's so good to have you on the show today. Thanks for coming out.
Thank you, Jessica. It's really nice to be here.
Yeah. So most people who are really into wellness in the fire service have an origin story. What is yours?
I originally started out wanting to be a teacher, not really wanting to be a
Oh,
firefighter. So I
okay.
wanted to be a teacher.
Hmm.
Couldn't get into teachers college, but I really had that appetite for really wanting to teach. So when I got into fire,
Hmm.
after taking a skills and interest test, and it took about 3.5 years after that time to get in, I started realizing that, there's an appetite to have a little psychology mixed with the fire service. And the psychology was my educational background.
Hmm.
So I started looking into Canadian organizational behavior. The fire chief at the time, when I first started, he had textbooks in each of our stations. Came across workplace stress, and I just went down the rabbit hole. I loved it. I thought it was amazing. I thought it was something that was missing in the fire service at that time because I believe the Wellness Fitness Initiative had just been started between the IAFC and the IAFF. So
Hmm.
it was just starting to grab some traction, and stress just really became something of interest. So really got involved with that. And yeah, I don't know, what's that? That's 2002. And so I'm 23 years in the fire service. So yeah, that's a long time.
Uh, by firefighting standards, yeah, you're you're very wise,
Hmm.
man. Have you ever had like a dark night of the soul that kind of also piqued your interest in stress? Because I find a lot of us who kind of go into the wellness sphere have gone into that deep end of the pool and had our own personal experiences.
Yeah, 100%. My father in 1993 was diagnosed with cancer of the ear. So
Hmm.
he was one of 9 cases in North America. He was actually the last of the
Hmm.
survivors. And then when I got into fire, he ended up kind of going more towards the latter stages of his life. And he just became very, very obsessed with trying to figure out what was going on with him because he was young. I mean, he was 41 when he was first diagnosed, and that's a very young age to have that diagnosis. And he had it for 14 years. So
Hmm.
my
Wow.
that dark stage was really watching him and how this cancer was really, really affecting him. And it's kind of funny because I went through my own personal stress probably just a couple of years before he ended up passing.
Hmm.
And I came across this book called The Monk Who Sold His Ferrari. And this was actually a point of prescription for me from a firefighter turned naturopathic doctor who I ended up using for my personal services. And
Hmm.
he part of the prescription to better health was reading this book, The Monk Who Sold His Ferrari. So after reading this, I was completely, and I went down the rabbit hole after that, after I just started reading ferociously. But anyways, going back to that story, is I gave this book to my father.
Hmm.
And no matter what I tried to do to get him to focus on all the different things and the good things that came out of this book, he started reading it, but it was just a little too far gone for him. So that was pretty
Yeah.
much the impetus when I went down that rabbit hole for stress and wellness.
Hmm. Thank you for sharing that with us.
Mm.
That's a long time to be in the fighting cancer, to be honest. So yeah, I can understand how that would, a lot of interesting learnings would, for both of you probably came out of that experience. You have this great quote about your belief that, when we're kind of happy at home in our roles as a husband, a wife, a spouse, a father, a mother, a parent, makes us better employees. So, can you kind of unpack that and expand, kind of launching from this story we just told about your dad? Why is it important for our emergency and non-emergency selves to kind of be in sync?
So I think whether it's fire service or whether it's just business in general, when people are being hired, we're not hiring them for the people they are, we're hiring them for the roles that they can do. But the people who they are personally is a huge contribution to who they're going to be at the job and on the role. My thought was is that if we have better people at home and they come to work, they're going to be better workers. And if work is a safe environment, an engaged environment, an empowered environment, getting people to actually take advantage of their ability to create purpose and contribution, then that trickles back to the home life.
Mhm.
So if you were to invert that and make it a dysfunctional home life and a dysfunctional organization, that's where I think we get a lot of these post-traumatic stress indicators, injuries, and disorders because we don't know in the fire services especially we don't know what we're going to get. We train, we do whatever we can to be as best prepared as possible, but we don't know what we're going to get. So we have to have people, our firefighters, coming in sound, and when they're coming from dysfunction and they're coming into work and they're coming into dysfunction as well at work, that renders a firefighter incredibly vulnerable. So if we can strengthen our home life and we strengthen our work life, I think we strengthen people in general. And this is how it creates those happier home life environments where, people are living longer, healthier, have better propensity to have a longer retirement and a healthier retirement. The children are actually growing up very healthy and going into uh, extra situations where they're going into their universities, colleges, whatever they want to be. And that's where I think it's actually really cyclical.
Yes. And that explains all the variability we see. You have a crew of people running a gnarly call, and one of them, it really hits them hard. And yeah, when you kind of trace it back to, well, what else are you juggling right now? What contributed to that reaction? So how do you think we account for that variability in people's learned coping mechanisms? Do we screen them as we hire them, or do we teach them once they're in the fire service? What solutions have you kind of envisioned for this?
A solution to this?
Hmm.
Well, it's not happening. Let's call it what it
Yeah,
is. Like
it's true.
we're just people are hired for their role.
Yeah,
But just the person is just they might have difficult coping skills. They might not have any at all. They
yeah,
might be a lot more vulnerable to the unpredictability of the stress and the job itself. I think personally, the way we do it is we actually put training in place where we actually develop the person. We have to bring resources in place, whether that's books, whether that's audio books, whether that's TED Talks or YouTube clips.
hmm,
Organizations, fire service organizations, fire service leaders, leadership teams need to invest into the people and not just make it autonomous and make it about them choosing to invest in themselves. We fire service leaders have a social responsibility to take care of their subordinates, all the firefighters and the employees.
hmm.
And part of that is helping them develop to be good human beings.
Yeah. Would you call that personal growth, or do you see it as something else?
No, I see it as responsibility.
Okay. Yeah, I
Um,
agree. It's like PPE for their character,
mhm.
essentially. If we leave them exposed, then of course the job will naturally expose vulnerabilities. That's what I found too. It got me. I only made it 8 years, and it was a bad interview. It wasn't because I couldn't do the job. It was just a bad interview got in my head, and that was all it took. I didn't have the mental capacity at that time as a late 20 something to overcome it. And I really regret that. Like that's one part of my life. I'm like, man, I wish I just had been able to reframe that.
You
Um,
know, Jessica, studies have shown that the human brain is still maturing up to the age of 25.
yeah.
So organizations that are choosing to hire individuals and hiring firefighters that are below the age of 25 are potentially making themselves susceptible to all these vulnerabilities of the unpredictability of the emergencies because the brain is still evolving. That means the emotions are evolving. That
Hmm.
means the prefrontal cortex is still evolving on how to, respond, not just react to situations. So there's a huge sense of responsibility we need to do to get these resources in place to help firefighters of all ages.
Hmm. Yeah. So I know in the past offline, we've kind of talked about the idea of more integration of different types of psychology. So sports psychology, actually having psychologists on staff. I know those were some of the ideas that we talked about offline. So let's dive into those. Let's start with psychologists and integrating them more into the fire service. How would we do it? What would that look like?
You take a look at a lot of the larger departments, at least here in Canada,
Hmm.
Toronto, Calgary, I believe Vancouver as well. They have psychologists inside their fire service. So they
Oh,
have,
okay.
yes, so they have larger operating budgets to put these in place.
Yeah.
It's the smaller departments that can't really afford it.
Hmm.
So the next best step is, can there be contractual? Can you use contract services to bring psychologists in on a temporary basis or as needed basis?
Hmm.
And then the other way to do it is just to educate, training officers or personnel who are going to be in charge of firefighters on the psychological concepts.
Hmm.
There's a huge assumption in the fire service that it's business oriented, it's public administration oriented, but really it's more about managing the people. I
Hmm.
mean, you take a look at Simon Sinek, he's talking about, you don't manage the results, you manage the people who are managing the people who are managing the results.
Hmm.
And we need to really consider putting more psychology into the fire service because there's such a benefit for understanding human behavior. There's such a benefit for understanding organizational behavior and dynamics. And
Hmm.
there's such a need for really understanding sports and performance because when you take a look at the fire service, there is an element of sport to the job.
Yeah.
We wear equipment, we don't run, we trot. Like it's almost like, you don't run on the pool deck kind of thing. You kind of trot, you don't run. But anytime there's a sense of urgency, we're moving. We wear equipment, we're doing exercises or we do movements, excuse me, that are actually reflective of exercising with whether it's in the gym or whether it's in a sport.
Hmm.
We need to kind of treat it more through an athletic lens.
Hmm. I'm most familiar with what's happening here in the Denver, Colorado area and the larger metro departments, and they really have leaned into the physical side of wellness. But I love your idea of really just bringing more into the culture. I think that's really where it's going to take hold is making it cool to bring that psychology piece in because it is so fascinating. Like once you really learn that, your performance does get better, like in a lot of aspects, and your home life can get better. And it just is a reverberating skill.
Fire departments are tasked with the responsibility to make sure that their firefighters are trained.
Yeah.
There's no person who's responsible for helping to make sure that the firefighters are developing as people,
Yeah.
right? There's no one that's inside the organization that's basically saying, okay, maybe this SOG doesn't make sense. Maybe this SOP needs to be used differently. Maybe crews need to be aligned differently. Maybe that there's, some interpersonal dynamics. Maybe there's some other ways we can do it. That's
Hmm.
where these psychologists come in. That's where these, not on a reactive stage, but more of the proactive stage where we're actually coming in and we're, assessing the situation and what can we do to kind of make this better, like kind of just ascertaining what those roadblocks could possibly be.
Hmm. It's one thing for your department to want to invest in you as a person, but how do we get the firefighters on board with wanting to invest in themselves? Because I sometimes you get that attitude of like I don't need to learn this shit, And so, what have you found to be successful for yourself and others, kind of motivating them?
My quick response would just be introducing it right from the recruit class training right on.
Hmm.
You embed these practices, these habits, you make it a part of the recruit class training.
Hmm.
If you have to add extra time to it, like another week onto the recruit class, so be it. But you instill these concepts, these habits into these firefighters, and then once they begin to, begin to radiate out into the different stations and to the different crews, they keep those practices going. And
Yeah.
hopefully that they maintain their connection through their cohorts, that
Hmm.
they actually start saying, okay, keeping themselves accountable. Have you done it today? What things have you practiced on? Have you reached any of the senior firefighters? Are they interested?
Hmm.
No firefighter that wants to go home not full, because any firefighter that goes home wants to come home to the refuge. They want to come home to feeling that sense of safety, that haven, and they don't want to feel that they're making contribution to the fact that that could be affecting the home life.
Hmm.
So we go through so much at work, so much unpredictability. There's a family, we could talk about family systems theory. We talk about how the firefighters do or do not get along within their second family at work.
Hmm.
Well, you can't just shut it off like a tap and go home. So we want to make sure that we can create good habits in place, good behaviors, good rituals.
Hmm.
So it not only just affects the second family, it affects the home family too.
Exactly. Would you say that not doing that is where we burn out? Just dropping the ball on that development and kind of ignoring big issues either at home or at work is where we hit that wall of burnout, or where do you think burnout comes from?
Well, actually, I wrote a paper on it called
Oh.
Beware called Beware of Burnout,
Uh-huh.
and I did some research, and I actually found that there was a stress management doctor who was a former physician that works out of Oakville, Ontario, Canada,
Hmm.
and he did research and he uncovered that it's not just the chronic work stress, the volume, the velocity, and the abuse that comes from a workplace stress, but it's also from the lack of rewards and a lack of sense of purpose.
Hmm.
And so there's two reasons why burnout does occur.
Hmm.
if we were to if we as a fire service entity begins to start focusing not just on the firefighter but on the person too, and allow that engagement, allow more empowerment, allow more contribution, I believe that you would actually find a lot less burnout in the organizations. So to add on that point, so Dr. Posen says that if a firefighter was to make some sort of contribution to the organization,
Hmm.
and but the person's not being recognized, that
Hmm.
person will try again.
Hmm.
And if they're not recognized, they'll try again. If it
Hmm.
creates this constant repetition of, I want to make contribution because I'm full of passion and I want to add contribution to the organization, but it's no longer recognized,
Hmm.
that's how you put the firefighter on that slide to burnout.
Yeah.
And what would actually make it even worse is when that firefighter is making contribution and his colleague or her colleague is making contribution as well, and they're getting recognized over that person. That's what sends the firefighter down that burnout as well slide.
Hmm.
So, you know, fire service leaders in general need to have a little bit more responsibility to say, okay, if these people are under our care, and I'm going to kind of quote that Simon Sinek, right? He says
Hmm.
leadership is like parenting. So if we look at leadership like parenting and we're looking after the children in the family, we want to make sure that everyone is getting equal opportunity, they're
Hmm.
getting equal love, they're getting equal appreciation, because we don't want favoritism in their families. Well, we don't want to have favoritism at work. And unfortunately, when that does happen, for whatever reason, it does make a higher propensity for people to go down the rabbit hole for burnout.
I have had conversations with other guests in the past where it's been suggested that maybe the critical relationship in this equation to provide that positive feedback is um, on the line with, your line firefighter and then their immediate supervisor. So whether that be a lieutenant or a captain, would you say that is where we really need to enact this kind of family feedback, or is it the chief's responsibility? Like, where does that responsibility really fall?
I believe it actually falls on everyone, but it needs to start at the top.
Hmm.
We can run organizations with just great crews, but then if those crews get separated, what happens? We
Yeah.
have to have it start at the top. It has
Hmm.
to permeate down through.
Yeah.
And there can't be um, guarding going on. If there's someone within the system
Hmm.
that doesn't feel that what the fire service leaders are seeking if they don't want it to come down or permeate down into the lower levels, that's another piece too that we have to take a look at. So, but it really needs to start at the top.
Hmm. How do chiefs then, or the top leadership, how do they set a good example or initiate this trend?
They have to value it. They have to make it part of their operating budgets. I mean, fire chiefs are provided their operating budgets or their full budgets
Hmm.
every single year, down by the city manager or the chief administrative officer. It's up to them how they want to divvy up that budget.
Yeah.
If if personal development, not just professional development, if personal development is not a part of it, then it's basically playing Russian roulette with the fact that we're hoping that firefighters are going to want to work on themselves.
Yeah.
But we haven't talked about stress. We haven't talked about family environments. We haven't talked about anything on the outside that
Hmm.
could really truly affect a firefighter's ability to have that autonomy that maybe that is expected of them.
Hmm.
So operating budgets, they need to really make sure that it's part of the allocation.
Yeah. We just had a incident here at one of the major Denver departments. And so I think right now in our some of our larger departments, there's so much disconnect between that where you're not really having these good habits in place. There's actually the presence of some bad habits too, which makes it hard to even think about personal development being on the table for everybody when you've got elements of corruption and misspending and stuff like that.
You know, the 16th president of the United States, Abraham Lincoln, has a famous quote that says, you know, if you want to test a man's character, and
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure he would be referring to females as well. If you want to test a person's character,
Mm-hmm.
give them power.
Yeah.
So when you have power, you have that ability to basically just do as you will because you're in that position to wield that power.
Yeah.
The problem is that when you're in a stressful situation, there's a very high propensity that you could actually go back to a set point. And there's very good chance that maybe some fire service leaders who might be doing questionable behavior could be that they were put under extensive series of stress, whether that's personal or professional,
Mm-hmm.
and they might have reverted back to maybe a set point when it actually worked for them. So
Yeah.
coupled with the sense of power, actually it's funny, but Dr. Keltner, who is a social psychologist at the UCLA Berkeley,
Mm-hmm.
says there's two types of power. So it's absolute and
Mm-hmm.
enduring. But
Okay.
he has a famous quote that he says, it's called the power paradox. He believes that the very skills that we use to get the power are the very ones that begin to deteriorate once we have it.
Interesting.
And he says that
Okay.
everyone is susceptible
Mm-hmm.
to this condition
Mm-hmm.
because power is intoxicating.
Yeah.
This is why I think power needs to be balanced with character.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's easier said than done, unfortunately, with this industry. I would like to think that everyone puts their own personal growth on as an important item, but as we learn sometimes in hindsight, that's not always the case, especially when power comes into the mix. So, what can we do maybe if listening who maybe have a chief, who they perceive as being distracted or whose priorities lie elsewhere? How can we as individuals kind of empower ourselves, no matter what rank we are, um, to develop these skills in ourselves, to develop resilience and our own personal growth? What's a few good starting points?
Well, a few good starting points is build your own personal library,
Hmm.
educate yourself, get involved in committees of some capacity, whether that's with the IFF or the IFC or any other type of committees that actually have a complete influence on the fire service, and begin to start making changes through some positive research, positive areas of expertise that maybe you might have stumbled upon through readings,
Hmm.
through some YouTube clips, resources, because I believe that's the way to do it.
Hmm.
It's very, very hard to get a fire service that's been, 150 years, 200 years unimpeded by progress, right? Of
Hmm.
tradition unimpeded by progress. So it's going to take a little bit to begin to start changing things.
Yeah.
but you have to own it. You have to take that ownership. You have to be true to who you are
Hmm.
and just enjoy, relish, absorb best practices that might exist on the outside of the fire service, not just on the inside.
Mm. Yes. Yes. Why is it important to have an alter ego that's not a firefighter that you employ in your arsenal of personal growth?
I think the quick answer to that is that if you just become, if it's just fire related, that's all you're really going to have as an identity. It's
Yeah.
just fire. You want to really be balanced. The person really wants to be balanced because, like we're talking about, firefighting is great. But it's a function. It's a role. It's
Hmm.
not who you are. It's just what you do. Who you are defines how you're going to be as a parent, how you're going to be as a partner, how you're going to be as a friend.
Hmm.
If it's just fire, 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 and that's your identity, then when under stress or under duress situations, it just might be a compromising situation for someone.
Hmm. So let's talk about flow, because I know we've also talked offline about this. This is one of my favorite topics. Flow. What is flow? How do you define flow, James, for yourself?
Well, and this is going to be a mouthful, but the late Dr. Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, who was a former University of Chicago professor, um, he identified that there was this idea or this concept or this theory of the best that people were feeling. They were more creative. They were not under pressure. They were very focused. They lost track of time. When individuals were experiencing these situations or these moments, he called it flow. And what flow is that there's a graph that basically says as we increase our level of skill set,
Hmm.
it has to be based on the level of challenge. So if the challenge is 4 to 5% of a person's current level of skill set, they'll be in a state of flow.
Hmm.
If it's anything above, they could be in an anxious state. And if it's
Hmm.
anything below, they could be bored.
Hmm.
So the idea with it is that we're trying to get people to get their peak performance. And that could be anything, right? He studied chess players, he studied um, surfers, I believe. Like he studied a whole bunch of different individuals in society, and he came up with the same thing. So the coolest thing about flow is that it keeps people away from boredom and
Hmm.
it keeps people away from burnout. And
Hmm.
so when we're getting into flow, we're getting into that peak performance.
Hmm.
We're getting the best out of our employees.
Hmm. I have a theory that when we're bored, we actually perpetuate drama and trauma as a means of excitement. And so, would you agree with that? Do you think when people are bored, they tend to stir things up or engage in, petty arguments and stuff like that to get excited again?
Well, I think the interesting thing is human behavior. As human beings, we crave novelty.
Yeah,
So when we are bored, we're going to find something to do to
yeah.
create that sense of novelty.
Hmm. That element of emotional mastery and peak performance kind of go hand in hand because then at least you're aware, you're more aware that when you're going into those patterns and stuff. Is that what you've found with yourself as well in growing yourself?
Well, I kind of really stumbled upon all this stuff later in life. I was a varsity football athlete and I didn't really get these concepts until later in life. But yeah, that's pretty much it. Like, when you identify what that peak, the Yerkes and Dodson curve, which basically says as we increase in stress, or sorry, increase in arousal, our
Hmm.
performance increases as well. But
Hmm.
it's a bell curve, so it only peaks. And then they uncovered that as more arousal is applied, the performance begins to decrease. But it's the peak performance. It's that sweet spot, that 4 to 5% where we're actually going into flow, where we have more focus and stuff like that
Hmm.
that it's really, really truly the place to be.
Hmm.
And yeah, from my own personal work that I've kind of done as of recent,
Hmm.
it just seems to be easier to maintain it because I
Hmm.
just use that 1% either going forward or 1% going backward.
Hmm.
And I think it's, it's interesting because a lot of people feel that peak performance is about maintaining that high level all the time.
Hmm.
Another study that was done, they found that it was actually for every 90 minutes of activity, you need to have a 20-minute sense of rest.
Hmm.
So, and that's an ultradian rhythm, right? That's something that occurs in our bodies all throughout the day.
Okay.
To get that peak performance, you have to keep up with that ultradian rhythm in order to, because you have to have a sense of rest and recuperation from the work that you're doing.
Hmm. Interesting.
So all these pieces, and I think this is why sports or performance psychologists would make an incredible asset to the fire department because they get these concepts. They can help with, if training's gone on for a longer period of time, just like, okay, well, we need to take a break because if we want to go back into another evolution that has to be, guys or the crew has to be in peak performance,
Hmm.
mentally, physically, emotionally, and spiritually, they need to have that recuperation time.
Hmm.
So, it's all these different pieces that just really work well with peak performance.
I think we're just realizing we're like something this is a part of ourselves that we need to address when we're first responders for sure, like for sure must happen. Just if for the simple fact of the statistics that we're seeing right now with stress levels and PTSD and suicidality and all of these things that are like, okay, we now have to turn towards a lot of these more interesting things like visualization, personal growth, rest and peak cycles, flow, a lot of this fun kind of mental stuff that I think can be just as exciting as working out. It used to be you go to the gym, you get really excited about getting jacked, but there's a lot of fun, I think, in personal growth and mental development too. At least for me, I've find it really exciting. I think for any other psychology nerd, there's something really fascinating.
If we want to get the best out of our firefighters, it
Hmm.
can't just be about training fire.
Yeah, yeah.
It has to be about how to get the best out of the human body. And that means peak performance, that means rest and recuperation,
Hmm.
that's meditation, that's focusing on the physical, mental, emotional, spiritual capacities for the ideal performance state.
Hmm.
This is how you're going to get the best out of your firefighters. This is how you're going to minimize them uh, taking short-term, long-term stress leaves. This is going to decrease the anxiety to depressive rates that we're seeing inside the fire service. This will decrease suicidal ideation.
Yeah.
There's a huge assumption that suicidal ideation has to do with the call that someone's gone on. They're not looking at the building blocks that affected that person up until that call.
Hmm.
They're just focusing on what on the call that actually put someone over the edge. We need to do a better job to build the person to accentuate the role. To talk about Coach John Wooden, right? UCLA Bruins. He focused on the players as students and people
Hmm.
to make them better as college basketball athletes.
Hmm.
We need to do that.
Yes. Do you find that is our Canadian fire companies, are they leaning into this? When you go out and you instruct and you talk to people in other departments, are they leaning into it in Canada? Because it feels like in the US we're still kind of we're still trying to even get on the boat that this is useful. So
Uh, to be perfectly blunt, I think it's actually a fire service sticking point. So to answer your question, no. There are a handful of departments that have been taking a proactive step,
mhm,
but they're really more the exception than the norm.
yeah.
But from the fire service in general, because we are deeply entrenched in our traditions that have always worked, it's very hard to accept. It was Chief Alan Brunacini that said firefighters hate two things. Well, they hate change and
Hmm.
they hate the way things are.
Yeah.
A, a fire service leader is a firefighter by trade.
Hmm.
So it's very possible that that mentality, that modality of the way what Chief Brunacini was talking about actually permeated up through the ranks. So
Hmm.
to get people to try to change, to take a risk, to try unconventional ideas and concepts like flow, which could be looked at as maybe, not really so much for fire,
Hmm.
well, that's pretty risky.
Hmm. Yeah. Yes, and even just making space for dissenting views and really learning from our mistakes. How can we foster more of an environment for dissenting views in the fire service or new information? Is there a good entry point for this information?
Dr. Amy Edmondson, Harvard Business Review,
Hmm.
Harvard Business professor,
Hmm.
wrote basically is the pioneer when it comes to psychological safety.
Hmm.
Everything that she's talked about, everything she espouses is about if we don't have dissenting views, if we don't have the ability to say, you know, here, pointing something out to someone,
Hmm.
they have the risk, that organization has the risk of going down that situation that just it could turn into a dysfunctional organization because people then become fearful of opening, saying something or allowing things to be turned the other way. There's a concept called willful blindness from Margaret Heffernan,
Hmm.
and she talks about, just that ostrich effect, like turning your head as if you didn't see it coming. you
Hmm.
know
Yeah.
it was Judge Simon Lake that said, you're culpable, if you could have known or should have known something instead you strove not to see, you are responsible. So there is a huge responsibility that comes with the fire service leader and officers in general to make sure that they're doing whatever they can to create that safety, to not
Hmm.
just turn a blind eye, to if they're thinking something's going on, to maybe explore it a little bit more.
Hmm.
There's a huge social responsibility. There's a huge duty that we have to make sure everyone in the environment's safe. And psychological safety, dissenting views
Hmm.
is just one of those pieces.
Hmm. What keeps you going? Because I hear a lot in your discussing your perception of the fire service and their openness to these ideas as being a wellness advocate and someone who talks to this stuff. What keeps you talking about it if you perceive that we have so far to go? I'm just curious, as someone who is also, I feel, in the same boat, paddling along with you. What keeps you going and talking about this stuff and tooting the horn?
When I first wanted to be a teacher, I decided to volunteer in a classroom. And what I ended up doing was when it came to teaching math or helping out with kids with other different subjects, I seemed to have an ability to actually listen to what they were talking about and listen to their interests and then basically pulling that interest and applying the math.
Hmm.
When I was able to do that, it was like I could see the proverbial light bulb go off.
Hmm.
In a way, in an essence, I feel like I'm doing the same thing with these outside concepts.
Hmm.
And it is the biggest satisfaction when I see someone and you can see the same proverbial light bulb go off with
Hmm.
them and go,
Hmm.
I never thought of that. Or that's very interesting. Or I get it now.
Hmm.
That's my drive.
Hmm.
Because I find that it is exciting to see someone never look at a situation before, taking a look at it through a different lens and go, wow, that might actually work.
Hmm.
That's my drive. That's what keeps me going.
Hmm. That makes sense. Yes. I love that too. Insight, mutual insight and the excitement of, again, mental exploration. I'm all about it. Is there anything we haven't touched on that you feel like is really important to include in this conversation?
Yes, I think there's a responsibility that the firefighter has to have in
Hmm.
addition to the organization, in addition to the fire service leaders.
Hmm.
Everyone has to take their own sense of responsibility to work together
Hmm.
to find better ways of doing business.
Hmm.
Because the mental behavioral health issue, especially now, is still continuing to rise.
Yeah.
People are still off, turnover is still there. high
Hmm.
anxiety, high depressive rates, unfortunately, suicidal ideations and death by suicide still occurring. So whatever we're doing, we need to change.
Hmm.
And I think, you know, I guess the to answer your question is the term Kaizen. So Kaizen is a Japanese term coined by one of these American professors, but actually tasked with the responsibility to go back to Japan after post World War II
Hmm.
and help it reconstruct.
Hmm.
And in doing so, he came up and brought over an American concept, which was called continuous improvement. And the
Hmm.
Japanese culture ended up adopting it and turning it into Kaizen. It's about doing 1% incremental changes on a daily basis.
Hmm.
To answer your question, if there's a remote question of whether people can or cannot do these concepts that we talked about in this podcast, all they have to do is adopt the Kaizen model of 1% incremental changes on a daily basis. And
Hmm.
it'll be surprising what we put into place, because if something is too much too fast, it activates the fight or flight response,
Hmm.
which means it activates everyone's fear, right? So we
Yeah.
either fight it or we run away from it.
Hmm.
Adding in that 1% incremental changes, very, very small changes, bypasses the evolutionary flight or flight response because it's so small, it's not perceived as a threat.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's not as intimidating to begin. It's like,
Mm-hmm.
okay, I can do 1% a day. Yes. I would also encourage those who are watching, if you're if you feel like you're beating your head against a wall or with any situation, your own emotions, a situation at work, like I always think there's a book for that. Like everything's figure outable and pursuing the path of knowledge as a solution and being able to, and then integration, and just try it out. So I think we underestimate, and I think you'll appreciate this as a teacher, just how much power there is in knowledge. And there's some knowledge out there that you can find. You just got to go find it. You don't have to keep banging your head. Um, so,
It's kind of funny. So I watched the show Mayday religiously. I
uh-huh.
love it. Not that I love watching plane crashes. I love the explanations of why they ended up crashing.
Hmm.
I took copious amount of notes,
Really.
which ended up turning into and manifesting into a committee
Hmm.
called Human Factors and Human Performance that we created with the Canadian Association of Fire Chiefs.
Hmm.
But the point being is that if any firefighter, fire officer, chief officer, fire service leader on this podcast listens to this podcast, there's so much information that we can derive from movies, from TV shows, from YouTube clips,
Hmm.
from commercials. Anything that becomes inspiring, anything that we can use to apply to make the organization better,
Hmm.
the answers are out there.
Hmm.
We just have to be in the moment, be in that frame, that state of being, if you will, to capture it. And it's funny. You would never see me walking around without my daytimer or pad of paper or something like that, because there's always something that trickles in,
Hmm.
and always have that aha moment. So
Hmm.
there's information out there. We just need to find it and apply it.
Yes. Yes. It's very interesting. I don't know if you've ever looked into the neural mechanisms of insight, but it's from mind wandering. It's just letting your mind, when you're only half paying attention, but you're still listening. And then that one little piece of info, like you said, even from a commercial, you can have all of this like, whoa, get that
You
little
know, you
flash of
know,
insight.
we go back to the Robin Sharma, and he talked about the book, The Monk Who Sold His Ferrari. One of the things he talks about is communing with nature.
Mm.
And when you're in nature, it's like all your senses are activated, right?
Hmm.
Not your taste, but everything else, right? Your sight, your hearing, your touch, everything is activated.
Hmm.
That's when you're in that state of flow. That's when you're in the problem solving mode. And I think what's interesting is that if anyone is dealing with a problem,
Hmm.
personal or professional, commune with nature and you'll be surprised at the creativity that begins to flutter in
Hmm.
to solve the problems. And I don't think we take enough time to unplug
Hmm.
and recuperate, because, when you go to the gym and you're working out, your muscles don't grow when you're working out at the gym. Your muscle grows on the days off that you're resting.
Yeah.
And it's the same thing with your mind.
Hmm. Yes. Yes. So much yes to that. I always I always like to leave our viewers with one tool or resource so they can kind of continue their information from this conversation. What would you recommend to us, James?
Well, I have a book here called Good Business.
I,
Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi wrote it.
hmm
And
Excellent.
if if anyone wants to read it, there's application for personal, for professional, but it's something that I just firmly believe in. I just really think that if we get more focus, we get more creativity, we get more people intrinsically satisfied,
Mhm.
we might really put a dent in this mental behavioral health issues that we're seeing across the fire service indefinitely.
Mhm. In the world, really. I think this is our world, what's happening in the fire service is a microcosm of the bigger societal unrest, all the mental health problems. Like, I think we all need this advice. So even if you're not a firefighter watching today, this is all good life stuff, learning. So thank you. James, any closing thoughts before we wrap things up?
No, not really. I'm really honored to be here. I'm really thankful to be able to share all these different ideas and theories and practices. I appreciate your open-mindedness with this because I know a lot of this stuff is probably not really common in the fire service. So I appreciate the latitude with allowing me to share these different pieces. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks for bringing all your great statistics and professor names you dropped. I can tell you're very versed in these subjects. You just whip out these statistics. So it inspired me. So thank you again. And thank you to our community. If you're still watching with us, you're amazing. And I will put the link to the book James mentioned in our show notes today. And we appreciate your participation in conversations like these, because this is how, getting these ideas into the culture is where it's going to start. So thank you to everyone who's watching. And if you have any feedback or want to follow up with any questions, my door is always open to you at info@firepowerx.com. And guys, we'll see you all in the next episode. Thanks for now.